This is the last slideshow. This is the last criticism that we will take a look at. In terms of where we're going from here, I will post on, I'm going to have to sort of try to adapt what we would normally do, and I'll post that on Monday. There will be no, I mentioned on Slack this morning, no new work for tomorrow. So you have the painted door to read and this video to watch until next week. Okay, so formalist criticism is essentially, if you recall at the beginning of this unit, I said we were going to ignore the plot, ignore the characters, and only focus on certain aspects of the stories. Well, with formalist criticism, we are going to actually focus on plot, character, etc. So this is what you've been doing your entire high school career, most likely. You just didn't know it, okay? So we have the plot. The plot, you should all be aware of by now, is the story of, is the sequence of events that makes up the story that you're reading or watching, I suppose. And it can be broken down roughly into the following parts. You have the introduction, where the setting and the characters are introduced to you, the reader or viewer. And then you need some sort of conflict. You need some sort of thing that happens that makes it a story. If you don't have a conflict, you don't have a story at all. So it's often referred to as the engine that drives the story. In grade 9, you looked at the conflicts and how the different kinds of conflicts, where you could have person versus person or versus nature, etc., etc. And generally it begins with a trigger incident, which generally marks the end of the introduction. If you remember, or perhaps you did draw in grade 9 or 10 a plot graph, the trigger incident is where the plot graph begins to rise sharply in the middle there. We have the rising action, which is the portion of the plot graph where it climbs steeply, and it is essentially the various obstacles for the protagonist to reach his or her goal, which is usually, trying to solve the conflict, whatever it is. Then we have the climax, which is often misidentified as the most exciting moment, but that's not quite what it is. It's more specifically when the conflict comes to its highest point. So it's when the tension surrounding the surrounding the conflict is at its highest point, usually at the end. The resolution is not always present, but it is the little flat bit of the graph after the action comes back down. I hope you can all visualize a plot graph that I'm referring to over and over here. But it's just kind of like when the characters come together to sort of debrief after the climax and after the conflict has been resolved. So in formalist criticism, you take apart the plot like that because they, or you, if you're doing formalist criticism, you want to see how the structure rather of the story works towards its meaning. So can you sort of discern any kind of meaning of the story by looking at how the story is structured? Okay, characters. You have your protagonist is generally the main character, but does not have to be a good character. So the protagonist can be a villainous, can be a bad character. The protagonist is involved in the conflict of the story, has to be, otherwise it doesn't work. And then you have the antagonist, whose character opposes the main character. They're in opposition. The antagonist is trying to prevent the protagonist from achieving his or her goal, generally speaking. So when you're looking at characters, you need to analyze their traits. And if I taught you in grade 9, we probably did this in painful detail. So you can look at the character's own thoughts in the story. The narrator might comment and give you insight into the character. You can look at what the character does, what the character says out loud, and you can also look at what other characters say about that main character or about whatever character you're analyzing. This, if we were actually in class, would have been a humorous little diversion of a Family Guy clip where where Stewie is roasting Brian about his novel. But we can't do that now. Feel free to follow that link if you want. More characters. Nope, that's the same slide. My bad. Not sure how that happened. There we go. Setting an atmosphere. Setting an atmosphere is where you take a look at, obviously, where the story takes place, what time of year, what time of day, what time of time, like, century-wise, era-wise, to see if those things will give you any clues to or help unlock the meaning, or whether they're significant at all. So location, so the Painted Door takes place on a farm in the country. It's not really specific in terms of time. A time of day, it takes place over a night, I believe. Time of century, I'm not quite sure it's specific. Time of year, it's the winter. And of day, as I mentioned, it takes place kind of overnight. Weather is key. Weather in the Painted Door, there is a blinding snowstorm, a massive blizzard. So pathetic fallacy is when the weather, when the mood or feeling of a story is reflected in the weather. And I think that the relationship between the two main characters, or between the main character and her husband in the Painted Door, is definitely stormy, especially as the story progresses. The mood of the story, how it feels, is it spooky? Is it funny? So again, the interesting question here is not what the setting is. So the setting is a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. That's not interesting. But what is interesting, and what is you need to be focused on here, is how the setting contributes to the theme or the characters in the story. So they're isolated. What does that mean? Etc. Okay, themes. The classic story, the classic sort of English question: what is the theme of this piece of writing? Or what is a theme of this piece of writing? And give me an example to justify it. The beauty of themes is that they're basically anything you want them to be, as long as you can give me some evidence to prove that. So generally they are universal truths. So they're big ideas like justice or relationships, love, evil, those kind of things. Oftentimes you can think of the theme as kind of the message conveyed by the author. So if you think about the Painted Door, there's a theme of loyalty or betrayal, those kind of things. A moral, if you think about morals of the story, morals of stories, the Aesop's fables, where they had a short little story and then there's a moral or a lesson at the end. It's a very simplistic kind of theme. Okay, moving on to style. The style of the story. What is the author's voice? So what kind of narration is in the story? If it's first person, I, where the character is describing the story, him or herself. Second person or third person, where it's he, she. Going from memory, I believe the Painted Door is third person, but I'm not entirely positive about that right now. You can have limited narration or omniscient. Omniscient here means all-knowing, so the narrator sometimes a narrator would know characters' thoughts, would know everything. Involved or objective, so the narrator can be involved in the story and the conflict, or be removed from it and be objective. Sometimes the narrator can be reliable. Most often is reliable, sometimes not. That's a little bit of a wrinkle that an author can throw in there. Diction is word choice. So you take a look at the words that the author uses to describe people or things to see if there's a sort of a trend there. Does the author use negative words all the time to describe a person or a thing? So you can take a look at specific word choices the author makes to kind of get insight into the story. Literary devices. These things I'm going to fly through here. You've done these more than you probably care to. All of those things are devices the author can use to make their story more interesting and to convey meaning to their story. So again, just to reiterate the point at the bottom there, to reiterate that the formalist critics, or when you're doing formalist criticism, you're taking the story apart, but that's only the first step. You need to take that next step of analyzing what you take apart in order to try to make, in order to inform the story as a whole. So what does the setting, for example, contribute to the overall story, and so on. All right, so that's a celebration. Doesn't matter. The painted door is the one that I've assigned, and because it's formalist, it doesn't really matter which story you do. Every story can be done through formalism. So read the painted door and take a look at it from formalist perspective.